All right, everybody, so I'm Tom Newmark. So I'm here presenting tonight. I'm really like a guest speaker for Transparency in Education. So Jim Lehman runs Transparency in Education. He's like an army of one, right? And so we'll bring in guest speakers. So I just want to make sure everyone knew that's the relationship. I'm speaking sort of my views and what research views about health and sex education. And Jim would, I'm sure, agree with all of this, but the point is that I'm not officially speaking on behalf of Transparency in Education. I'm simply presenting as a speaker. If you want the official word, ask Jim what he thinks. He'll probably agree with me. Jim's actually out of town today, so he can't do this. So yeah, Tom Newmark, I started, just a little bio, I started the Frederick Classical Charter School in town, for those of you that are familiar with the Frederick Classical Charter School. Currently ranked #1 charter school in the state of Maryland, which is pretty cool, according to the U.S. News and World Report. And I spent a lot of time in education policy. My real job is actually as a software engineer, but I got into education. My wife's a teacher and a principal. She runs St. Thomas More. And so I've been just involved in that arena for many years, many decades, actually. So tonight we're going to talk about health and sex education concerns, a consumer's guide. And really our goal here tonight is to sort of explain what's happening in Frederick County public schools with regard to sex education. There's been a big change proposed recently, and our speaker, April Montgomery, who's going to speak later, is going to step you through some of the local things that have happened. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the ideas surrounding sex education, give you some examples of the lesson plans that are proposed for Maryland, and build that history, and then April is going to explain what's happening here locally and what you can do, parents, if you do share concerns about sex education. Any questions before I start? All right. Yes, ma'am.
Was this, what we're about to see, was that custom made for us?
Yeah, this is me and April put it together. It's made for you. It's not from any other organization. It's something she and I worked on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it'll be posted on Transparency in Education's website, so if you want to see it again, you're welcome to take pictures, notes, or anything, but do know it'll be on the website, so if you don't want to take pictures as I flip through, it'll be available for you. And one thing I'll say too, if you disagree, I love it when people disagree or have questions. That's great. Like, definitely ask me those questions and express those disagreements, because I love the opportunity to talk about the reasons why we're saying the things that are the concerns that we have. So topics we're going to go over: controversial earlier sexologists, some of the activist organizations that are involved in sex education, what, quote, comprehensive sex education means. Might not mean what you think. It might be quite different than you think. And then we're going to show some of the instruction materials that are actually being used or proposed to use. And then where do the teachers get their training from? And then sex ed history from a local perspective. April's going to talk about that. And then what parents and citizens can do. April is going to talk about that as well. So that's our agenda. And I do recommend, if you want a book about it, Miriam Grossman. She's a pediatric psychiatrist, and she's on the internet a lot. You can go Google her. She wrote a book in 2008 predicting basically all of this would happen across the nation. She was seeing some of this happen in California, and pretty much every one of her predictions came right. So if you want to read something that came out again, 2008, it was amazing that she called it as well as she did. But she talks about sex education and how it actually is harmful to kids, the current version of it. So the idea to do sex education is some of the ideas in sex education that will be taught this year didn't just arrive out of nowhere. They've been, oh, that's good. Can you guys see that better?
Yeah.
All right. Didn't arrive out of nowhere. So one of the first, and we can go way back, but I'm going to stick to kind of modern history, so the 1900s, 1920s. So there's a man named Alfred Kinsey. Does anyone, you guys know about him? Raise your hand. There's a movie, right? You can watch about him. Pretty true to life. There's a whole book written about him. You can check out a library that gives his whole history. But he's considered a pioneer. And my goal here is not to sort of smear Kinsey or portray him as a hero. Just he's a very controversial figure. All these there's three figures I'm going to talk about, are very controversial. So one of the things he did is he invented what's called the Kinsey scale after him, where he discovered that, or determined that sexuality was actually on a continuum, right, from the very gay to the very straight. And that was a concept that people didn't have in any formal way prior to him doing that. So he's really regarded as a pioneer for coming up with this idea that your desire can be on a scale, and you can be in the middle, you can be bisexual. So he himself would if you read his biography, it was pretty obvious he was bisexual. That was not accepted in the day, and that actually drove some of his interest in this area. And so, unfortunately, he did report orgasms in children as young as 2 months old. Apparently, he claims that they were from memory, from the children's own memory. I question whether a 2-month-old would have memory of that happening. And he did encourage adult child sexual conduct. So his big thing was he was very anti kind of the Judeo-Christian mores and just general mores in society. You don't have to be Jewish or Christian to think that pedophilia is not a good thing. But he really felt that a lot of the societal restrictions were like barriers, including even with children, which he had said that he thought that kind of contact could be okay. It's actually in his biography. Yeah, so he actually thought in certain situations that could be okay and even helpful. I think most parents would disagree. So he was a pornographer in the sense that he recorded sex acts in his attic as part of his research, and he collected pornography worldwide. He is a sexual sadist. He is actually hospitalized. He unfortunately traumatized his own genitals as part of trying to achieve what he was trying to achieve sexually for himself. And then his autobiographer and lots of others have speculated. It seems pretty clear there's a pattern that a lot of his research was driven by his own sexual needs. He had a hunger for sex, and at that time, being bisexual was not something that was really allowable. So this is a way, I think, that he could explore what his interests. And really, the big theme of Kinsey is sexual liberation. He was really against traditional values. He grew up in a traditional Methodist household, ultimately became a Congregationalist, which is a more liberal denomination, and kind of went back and forth about the religious thing. He started out religious and then was very anti-religious. And ultimately, he thought that traditional values were very repressive and that society could be better, could be happier if we didn't have restrictions on that. Some of the things that many people would think are good today, for example, is he was a big supporter of gay people being liberated, right, of being able to live freely and openly. And so that was, in that way, I think we could all agree he's ahead of his time in terms of that. He did advocate for early sexual experiences. I think most parents would have questions about that. And pansexuality, which that was the term that was kind of used then. I think now we call it bisexuality. It means something slightly different now. Avoiding fidelity, interesting. So he and his wife had a very interesting relationship where they started out pretty traditional, but ultimately they did find other partners and very complicated autobiography period. And he did promote early sex education, which is what we're here to talk about. On the negative side, of course, and obviously many of those things are negative, is that he used unrepresented samples. He had very bad research, even at the time, even though he was a pioneer. He had an interest in pedophiles, sex offenders, and prostitutes, and at the time, his research was widely questioned. So he fascinated people, but also objectively, that maybe the research wasn't so well done. So when he was claiming certain statistics about the prevalence of homosexual behavior, for example, well, he was using examples that were kind of skewed. Ultimately, his worldview kind of prevailed. A lot of the sex education reflects his views to some degree, and argue about to what degree, and most of the popular press, And so, in some ways, I would argue that these things are good. In some ways, maybe not so good. But his worldview did prevail. He really wanted to, really for his own needs, have bisexuality, I believe, be more accepted and homosexuality accepted. And that was a driving force in his life. So then another person in the 1960s, and if you hear about how many guys have heard about the gender policy? We've been talking about the gender policy since February. So this is the guy that popularized the idea from another researcher called Ronald Stoller. So Stoller did the research. This guy popularized it, this idea of a gender identity, that anyone, when they're born, could have a malleable gender identity up to 2.5 years. Once you turn 2.5, apparently there's a magic number, not backed up by any research, but he decided that was the number. And they could be environmentally directed by adults. So if you're a boy, and you could be raised as a girl. He really, truly believed this. He was famously disproven. So there was a pair of twins that one of them had a horrible circumcision that basically destroyed his penis. And it was a botched circumcision. And what happened was parents went to Dr. Money and said, well, what do we do with this situation? He said, well, raise the boy as a girl. well, it never took. And unfortunately, David Raymer ultimately committed suicide. But he did find out in his teenage years, early teenage years, that he really was a boy, and his life made sense to him. I was never interested in stuff that girls were interested in. You guys maybe wear dresses and all these things. He was a boy, right? So the theory, when people talk about gender identity theory, I always remind them the first instance of this was famously disproven. So there's other theories related to gender identity, but the original conception that it's malleable into 2.5 years was famously disproven. That's an important point that we'll get to later when we talk about SCPS that's going to teach this. And unfortunately, he and his brother had, David Raymer and his brother actually had to practice simulated sex positions. The idea was, well, here you have these twin boys, we'll raise one as a girl, the girl needs to learn how that works. So we're going to kind of teach it from a young age. How you would actually do it was simulate the sex positions. And that'll help you acclimate as the boy who's being raised as a girl into a role where she, they thought, would be female. So obviously this today would be considered child abuse. They didn't commit sexual acts as far as we know, but they were asked to simulate the positions, right? So most people today would call it child abuse. And then he was a liar, so even though David Raymer continued to say, yeah, you guys tried to raise me a girl, it didn't work, right? For years, John Mahoney said it was a success, and people would come to him as the expert for these unusual situations. So it's unfortunate, but he did put his reputation above science.